at where we were at in the 50s or even the 90s. You know, like we'll kind of return to a like baseline. There's this baseline that America tends to exist at. Oh, all right. We're good. Welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am Pastor Dave.
I am Recovering Heretic Dan.
Returned. Dan has been healed. He's no longer dying. And we are back from our Easter break. So, yes, here we are.
Yeah, that dying process is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's struck me as ironic. I haven't been sick
like that
since before the pandemic.
And then
it's like, let's make up for it.
Let's make up for it all at once. All right. Yes.
Well, I'll let you start. I mean, it's been a while. Anything you want to say before we get into the hard questions?
Just let's get to our questions.
Okay.
So we don't want to subtract any time from our questioneering.
No, we don't. And this is one that it's another one, kind of like 2 weeks ago with the Easter thing. There were things I never noticed. In over 6 decades.
Yeah.
With the mini resurrections that happened.
Yeah.
That nobody talks about.
Yeah.
So more of that. Now, speaking of people not talking about stuff, Easter afternoon, right? We all know the story of the Passion.
Yeah.
And we know the story of Mary going to the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
And then the slight variations of what happened in the hour after that.
Right.
Nobody talks about what Jesus did the rest of the day, what else was going on. We get this little hint with these 2 dudes walking to Emmaus.
Yeah.
And part of it, my big question, overall question, we'll get to specifics, especially as Steve starts asking. Hi, Steve. Glad to have you back. Why? Why don't we talk about it seems anticlimactic, and yet it's so critical to realize, because that's the proof that nobody just stole the body. Nobody just hid the body so they could make up the religion, claim that there was a resurrection, because just a body missing means nothing. It could be 2 grave robbers went in.
Yeah.
So our whole faith is structured on the fact that it was an actual resurrection.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about all the different evidences for the early disciples. Past, say, Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why don't we emphasize that more? Why does it's like?
Well, in terms of evidence, there's kind of a just baseline. What more evidence besides the stories that we have? If you weren't convinced by the stories that we have, you weren't going to be convinced by 40 more days worth of stories, right? At this point, it's like you either believe the basic premise or you don't, and another miracle story, another thing won't help you. You know what I mean? Another healing story, another, thing wouldn't really convince you any more than anything else if you're not predisposed to being convinced already. You know what I mean?
I do, but it almost seems like, I don't know, I want to say ignoring the elephant in the room in some ways, in that even with the incident with Thomas, right? Jesus is flat out saying 2,000 years ago, you needed evidence, but everybody else is just going to have to believe without it.
And he doesn't say it. Yeah, this is where we need to hear Thomas kind of differently. The point of that story is he gives each disciple what they need. And so Thomas isn't actually demanding anything more than the other disciples. All those early apostles actually needed exactly what Thomas got. Because that's how the story begins. Is they all put his fingers in the marks, and so Thomas is actually just demanding what everybody else got, and Thomas gets it.
So it shouldn't be doubting Thomas; it should be tardy Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, the word doubt's actually a bad word, because the word doubt's actually not in that story. The word Jesus uses, it gets translated as do not doubt, but believe. But actually, the word is unbelief, not doubt. Jesus says, do not be unbelieving, but believe. which is really
Yeah.
different than doubt.
Right? Yeah, it's very different than
that's a
doubt.
very different, do not be unbelieving, but believe, is actually what Jesus literally says in that. And so doubting's a bad word, I think, I think gives different connotations than it's meant to.
Yeah. Yeah, very definitely.
Yeah.
Yet again, I rail against the translators.
Yeah, right.
They're not giving us the...
All translators are either liars or blasphemers. So, as my Greek professor said, just got to accept it. So, some translations do say, "Do not be unbelieving, but believe," and those are better translations.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the crux of Thomas's thing. Yeah, I mean, one of the Gospels or Acts, one of the two, says Jesus spends the 50 days between Easter and Pentecost instructing the disciples, and so
giving a master class.
Yeah, they basically get this intense catechism class, and we don't need that because we've got the rest of the Gospels, and plus Paul's letters, and plus the other letters. So we've got enough.
But yet, and again, this is, remember, folks, the house heretic here.
Yeah.
Recovering. Dave always wants me to throw that in. But that's where, again, I see a little bit of, I don't know, a schism or two different religions between Paul and the disciples, in that Jesus gives them this intensive 50-day master class. Paul falls off a horse, has his vision. And yet we rely more on what Paul says. Today's readings, right?
But he also says he goes to, this is where it helps to read Paul's own words, right?
Okay.
So Paul actually says he spends a couple years in Damascus and in Saudi Arabia, and post,
okay.
Right? And so he doesn't jump straight to, I'm doing missionary journeys, right? Like, he
fall off my horse, get my vision back, and right into mission.
Yeah, right. Like he's preaching from day one, but he's preaching as, I used to be this, now I'm this, and so.
So he's preaching his conversion story initially.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So if you read this is in Galatians. So if you read the opening chapters of Galatians, Paul gets into this pretty heavy, where, he talks about, I was in Damascus and I was in Arabia, and that gets left out of Acts because it's not convenient for the story Luke is trying to tell.
Yeah. Okay.
And the point Luke is trying to make about Paul, and they didn't see eye to eye. So
Luke and Paul didn't see eye to eye? Is that?
That's my personal theory. If you kind of read them, they don't. What Paul says about his life and what Luke says about Paul's life are kind of different. There's a difference in outlook there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can see that. And I think that's part of what has made me feel through the years that in some ways Paul was preaching his own religion versus, because I relied a lot on Acts.
Yeah, right. And I would be careful just relying on Acts, because Paul is not that definite about, he talks about, he didn't even go to Jerusalem for like 3 years, or something like that. Right.
Yeah.
So like, he has a different experience than, it's a little different than laid out in the timeline in Acts.
Gotcha.
So
yeah, Acts definitely seems to compress it down.
It does, because that's Luke's making a point, right?
Yeah.
He's using history to make a point. So,
well, there was a line, and I'll bugger off of this in a minute, but it just brought up in 1 Peter today that made me wonder about, again, Paul focuses on grace so much, but 1 Peter, actually, let me see if I can find it so I can quote it correctly. Yeah, in 1 Peter, it kind of starts with the one who judges all people impartially according to their deeds. And that, I'm kind of wondering, how does, Peter's statement like that, being judged according to your deeds, how does that mesh with Paul saying it's not the deeds, it's grace?
Well, Paul says you'll be judged according to your deeds too.
Okay.
They both say that. Got to remember this week's reading picks up halfway through the introduction of First Peter, so you're catching the so that bit without the grace part, beforehand this week. Paul says it too. I mean, judgment is something we all face. And we will all face a verdict according to our deeds, which should make us all gulp a bit. The judgment will find us all
wanting,
and the judge is impartial, and so we'll have to honestly go through that, each and every one of us, and the difference is in the sentencing, if we're using the courtroom, not the judgment, but in the sentencing, that's the difference.
There's still the acknowledgement you did what you did, but time off for good behavior.
Right. Well, not even good behavior, just like time off because Jesus. That's the ultimate verdict. If we're using the courtroom metaphor is kind of flawed, but if we're using that courtroom metaphor, then
Jesus is our character witness.
Yeah, right. I mean, he's the sentencing guidelines, not the verdict will still be hard. The verdict is still, you were kind of a disaster. It's okay.
Yeah.
Lovable little disaster, but you're a disaster. So.
Meantime, welcome to the afterlife.
Yeah, welcome in. Plenty of room. So.
All right. Well, getting back to our later that afternoon.
Later that afternoon.
With Jesus.
Yep. Later that day.
With the two dudes from Emmaus again, are heading to Emmaus. There's that line about. Well, first of all, there's several things to unpack in that. Mm-hmm. One of them is the whole point that they're agog, that this guy didn't know anything about Jesus, as if everyone really was talking about it, which, like, historically we'd see something. And Steve actually brings up, he's amazed there wasn't an uprising of the people after the crucifixion, because same thing. By the gospel, it sounds like people were talking about it all over, hoping that Jesus would save them. And then finally leaders killed Jesus.
Yeah, it would have been a big week in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, Passover.
Well, Passover, but like if you just trace the arc of what Jesus has done. So if you read the Gospels, right? He marches in on Palm Sunday to a crowd of thousands, right? Mm-hmm. It's so bad the Romans think there's going to be a riot and or a revolution starting.
Now, perspective too on this, right? You hear a crowd of thousands, and that means one thing today. What did it mean back then? What was the population?
I mean, Jerusalem's like 50,000 people. Okay. So like
so a crowd of thousands is a good chunk.
It's a good chunk of people, right? Yeah. And like, so you have that. So that's how the week starts.
Okay. Right.
This crowd then goes. If you read the Gospels, it's clear that Jesus basically occupies the Temple Mount. This is not like, it says he's teaching in the temple, but you need to see this like Occupy Wall Street, kind of like the crowd just occupies the entire Temple Mount space, which is why he's always running into bouncing heads off against the chief priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees.
Because he's right on their turf.
He's right on their turf. He's like literally occupying their office, like it's a sit-in in their office spaces, basically, and he's doing this and he's teaching, and that's why they keep coming up to him, challenging him. This is where you get is it lawful to pay taxes? They keep trying to disprove him so that he'll get off their turf.
They can get back to
normal. If you can prove media tries to do this, right, with movements, right? If you can prove the Black Lives Matter organizer is a hypocrite, they'll go away, And so they keep trying to prove that Jesus isn't all that good a teacher, and he keeps winning because Jesus is very good at this game, but that's why they keep bouncing into him all the time, right? So
because he's right there.
Right. So in this space, in this same week, you get, is it lawful to pay taxes? You get the question about marriage in the kingdom of heaven, right? And resurrection. You get all these really famous stories, but they all come in that week because they're trying to get Jesus So then there's that, and then there's an arrest, a public trial, and a public execution, which was kind of like the circus. Like people went to these things for fun in the ancient world, right? Like
it was entertainment.
Right, it was entertainment, right? And so it would have been a big week. It's not that they were looking. It's not like they all hoped that Jesus was the coming Messiah. It's just, even if you didn't think he was the coming Messiah, you would have probably known, oh, here's this Jesus character. Like you would have known.
So it was like appointment television. Here's this Jesus character. Hey, we get to watch him, and a couple of side guys get
on the news at 7, right? Jesus again, right? Like. That would have been a big thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that everybody there, and the disciples themselves, yes, are really disappointed because they hoped he would be the one to redeem Israel. These things didn't turn out the way they thought. Again, that sequence of events, we march in victoriously, he occupies the Temple Mount, like surely the coming kingdom where we're about to kick out the Romans,
this is where it's going to happen,
is approaching, right? We are dangerously close, right? Because right next to the temple space is what we call the Antonia Fortress, which is the main fortress for the Roman garrison. That's probably where Pilate's palace was, and so like all this is happening in light of there's a Roman garrison right over there, and so, they're thinking, oh, this is day one of the revolution. Like we are here. Turns out not to be, but we are here, that kind of thing.
So the expectations were completely different than what we read.
Yeah, we were expecting this whole salvation drama, but for them it would have been painted as like, one of my favorite commentaries on Mark describes Jesus' actions through his ministry as like these direct action campaigns. And I was talking about this about Bible study, this morning, this would have been, they would have kind of viewed this as, this is the culmination of all these, anarchist direct action campaigns. Like we're there, this is the moment, like we've seeded the revolutionary consciousness. They're here.
So their disappointment was on multiple levels.
Yeah.
Not only is their leader killed, but we have this climax to our story and it fizzles.
Right. The revolution failed. And there's nothing more disillusioned than a former communist who thinks the revolution has failed. Right. If you ever met people like that, like, former communist who thinks they were on the verge of the real revolution.
Yeah.
It's like, people were just too cynical, like the powers that be won.
Yeah, and then they join Sachs Lehman.
Yeah, right. And they become the most cynical kind of people ever, but it's the same thing, right? Like,
Well, what about like these two guys on the way to Emmaus? First, is there anything significant about Emmaus? Was that picked intentionally?
No, it's just a village.
Okay, so this isn't one where there's a hidden meaning.
Like Bethany or Emmaus, there's all these outlying suburban villages, basically, kind of, within a day's trip of Jerusalem.
So here's another big question. Well, I should ask first, do we have other Sunday afternoon stories in the Bible? Or is Emmaus pretty much the end of what we're going to hear about that first day?
Well, we get the disciples unlock doors, and then the week after that is Thomas, right? So that's there's that sequence.
Yeah. So Thomas is a full week later.
Yeah, Thomas is a full week later, which is why we always read it on Easter too. Okay. This is Easter Day.
Yeah, and that's part of it, trying to piece it together. We're time tripping in our Sunday readings.
We're time tripping in our Sunday. This is Easter Day. I think that's it, Easter Day wise. Somewhere in that timetable is also Peter goes out fishing again and sees Jesus and jumps in the water naked and runs to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." Yeah, but that's later.
And that sounds like it's the beginning of the master class.
Yeah, that's basically the day one of the syllabus of.
Now, we don't get this popularly from the readings, but so Jesus doesn't like disappear and reappear from that point. He's like constantly with them, giving them master class.
We don't really know. I mean, it's hard to know what his presence exactly, because we don't get the full, like, what is that? Yeah, you get the impression that he was hanging out with him the whole time.
Yeah.
But in this story, he disappears into thin air. So,
Yeah.
like,
And it reminds me of like Kirk in the Immunity Syndrome, where he keeps phasing in and out.
yeah, right. And that's kind of how.
It's like Jesus hasn't figured out how to anchor into reality yet.
Right. Yeah. Right. It could be that. Or the physics of the resurrected body are obviously different. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which does get to a bigger question.
Uh huh.
If this is a resurrected body,
Yeah.
how come nobody recognizes Jesus when he comes back? It's
It's a
like
good question.
It's like he went to.
It's like the defining feature of the resurrected body is that people don't recognize him.
Yeah, it's like a Hollywood movie. Like he had
Right.
everything reconstructed before he came back.
Right. I don't know. I mean, that's one where you just don't know. Whatever that tells us about the resurrected body, it's obviously going to be different than. I think we have this image that like your resurrected body will be you in your 20s, and like that's obviously like not how it is,
Yeah.
because like whatever it is, people don't recognize him. He walks through walls. He can translocate, like he can do all these things that like are different, and so whatever it is, it's different than what we would imagine.
And yet, despite all that, he's still got the wounds. You think that'd be
Yep.
the first thing you'd fix?
Well, I mean,
At least in the feet, so you can walk around.
well, I mean, that's the powerful part of the message, right? Is like, even resurrected, we get to keep our wounds, which is, some people find that terribly comforting. Other people, I had one parishioner go, "That's an awful thought. I don't want to keep my wounds," But the promise is that you have new life with the wounds, not that they just disappear.
Well, I mean,
It's like Star Trek 5, right, where Kirk says, "I need my pain."
Yes.
Right? Like
It's what makes you who you are.
Right.
Without the wounds, you would be a completely different person today.
right, and that's also how we know it's a body. It's not a ghost, right? Because like there are things to touch. It's different, obviously, but there are marks to put your hands in, and fingers in, and things like that. So,
Yeah, which always seemed gross to me.
it is gross. It's utterly gross. The whole thing's gross.
Well, until my appendectomy.
Yeah, right.
Which, and then we had to change the gauze for a week.
Right. It's gross. The body's gross. Human bodies are gross things. God came up with this gross thing that we're in, but we're in it,
And it's ours, and damn it, you're getting another one.
Right. You're getting another one. There's no way to avoid it.
Oh man. Well, I'm trying to wrap my head around what that means. In that, is it like Dr. Manhattan in that, it's a physical body, but you have control over it. You can phase it through things.
You can phase it through things. Maybe, or maybe it's that way for Jesus,
Yeah, was Jesus teaching us quantum physics before we knew about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's something to be said for that, right? Or you exist, like, your existence is different, right? Whether you want to say you're on the string or the quantum level, like, so your body works differently or whatever it is, your plane of existence is different. Not undone, but just different. Transformed is the word Paul uses in 1 Corinthians.
That makes sense.
You will be transformed.
Why do we have so much of this in Luke? And contrast that with, say, Mark. Right, especially as you've talked about, the original Mark is just
ran away from the tomb.
Yeah, ran away from the tomb. End. Scene. Over. Yeah. And then, but Luke goes on. Here's what happened after. Why does Luke do that? Why didn't Mark?
Luke's writing later than Mark. Luke's writing at a time when the church has to process the fact that the church is beginning to process the fact that that Jesus is not coming back tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like the church is beginning that we may be in this for the long haul, and And so that then raises certain questions. So how is Jesus present? If you think Jesus is coming back tomorrow, all you can say is, well, just wait a week, he'll be here.
Yeah.
Like there's an imminency to his. But if he's not going to be here for 2,000 years, the end of the age might be a rather long time. How is he present in the community? So you get all these stories about how he's present in the community. So
starting with Sunday afternoon.
How is he present in the community? Luke just says it. He was present in the community in the breaking of the bread. It's actually quite a high sacramental theology if you think about it.
Yeah. The parallel of him blessing the bread and giving it to
right. It's communion, right? It's a communion story. It's supposed to be, but it's supposed to be because Luke's trying to answer this question of what does it mean to be church? What does it mean to be church? What does it mean for Christ to be present even though he's not here imminently returned? And so we get different. So Luke answers that in different ways. One is the sacrament, right? So he's present in the breaking of the bread. That's how he's revealed to us. Another way is Pentecost, right? We get the Holy Spirit, who gives us power to continue the work Jesus does in the meantime. And animates the church. And the other way is the church itself. Luke's a very churchy gospel, so so the community is dreadfully important.
With Luke being a churchy gospel, was the formal church beginning to form by Luke's time?
It gets
versus Mark's, where it's a lot looser?
Matthew and Luke are both like it's in that. The church has there's always the ecclesia, the church, right? But by Luke and Matthew's time, what's changing is one, the original apostles are dying. So like Luke's not an original apostle, right? Like Luke even talks about this in his intro. He says, I did interviews, with the people who were there, but he wasn't there, and
so he's our first, second generation.
Yeah, he's that second generation, right? I'm not an immediate witness. I believe in immediate witness. And so that's Luke. And so Luke's then conducting this. So the church is transitioning to that moment, that different organizing principle.
Could some of him talking about this also be a way of forestalling a morale drop, as the two from Emmaus, right? They had all this hope, and then Jesus is killed, and now the movement's dead. And so by Luke's time, he's trying to assuage, not drop that momentum. So is there like a second wave of people saying, "Well, he didn't come"?
And I think there's that kind of morale drop. There's other. The church is always facing a morale drop, and so whether it's that or it's. I think that we had hoped line is so powerful just because we're always kind of facing we're talking about that survey, right? And it's like, well, this is not what we had in mind. in the 90s when this building was built,
And just for reference, the survey there was an organization of interdenominational researchers, and they published their findings a couple weeks ago. The Economist printed them last week. And just showing a huge decline. Up to 45%, depending on your denomination. In religion in America. So that's that reference.
Right. And so whether it's that or it's your church is facing scandal of some kind, like there's always a morale drop facing the church. And so Luke tells this story. In his time, it was probably. This is taking a lot longer than we thought it was. You mean I still got to pay taxes? Well, I still got to go to work.
It's almost cult-like, right? You have these cults, and some of them end up killing themselves,
right?
Because the prophecy didn't come true when they thought it was going to come true. Talk about a drop in morale,
right? And some of them institutionalized, and so it's the institutionalization and saying. This is how, right? Which is true. It is.
Well, popping back to my demand for evidence, being evidentiary on things, Renee actually makes a pretty good point, which I had not considered before. And And she says that people don't tend to notice my missing finger,
Yeah.
you know? So to her, she thinks it's easy then to imagine people not noticing Jesus's wounds.
Yeah, right.
And we kind of have expectations to them. Jesus was dead, so you wouldn't be looking for signs.
No, you wouldn't be looking. Right. It's totally normal that they're not looking for it. You know, I don't fault them for it. You know, yeah, it's totally normal. You know, there's other things on like the evidence list sometimes that the Gospels don't say is just as much as what they do say. So like it was common in Jewish practice back then to store the body someplace for a couple days and then move it to its permanent burial site.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so
this tomb from Joseph of Arimathea may have only
was actually
been intended as a staging.
Yeah, it was actually probably that's what it was. That's what they're coming back to do is do the final staging, right? And that's what Lazarus is where he is, right? They're going to come back and do the final staging
once she stops stink-a-thing.
Yeah, right. You know, all that kind of stuff. And so, so then the disciples running around, the first thing they all go is the body's missing, right? The body's not there, and the fact that they tell people this then and that they're convinced by it is actually kind of mind-blowing because most people, if it were just normal practice, right? Of course the body would be missing from the place you put it originally. It's supposed to be. You know what I mean?
It's supposed to have been moved.
It's supposed to have been moved. So, you know, the fact that they're saying that and people believe it as a wondrous thing or an abnormal thing tells you something's going on that's different than normal burial practice at the time.
Boy, we need more historical perspective on this stuff.
Well,
I mean, seriously, it does. It affects the very way.
Yeah. Sometimes what they're not telling you tells you as much as what they are telling you. You know, the things they assumed people would understand.
But it does shape how we believe in our religion.
Yeah.
And this enhances it all the more. We're running out of time. Actually, we're out of time, so we got to go. I know this stuff will come up again.
Yep.
One final thing. Steve insists that I show the finger. Steve, obviously I can't because it's missing. I can't show you what's there, not there.
It'd be kind of weird if you held it, if you had it like
I
in a
wanted
jar
to
or somewhere.
The hospital would not let me keep it. I wanted to, but Renee will tell you, I wanted to put it in plexiglass and use it as a paperweight. Like doctors. God, had they never seen the Addams Family?
Right.
Do they have no appreciation
They
for
no
the morbid?
appreciation for culture.
Yeah.
On that wonderful note.
Right there, Steve, just so you can see. 1, 2, 3, 4.
On that wonderful note, we'll see you all later.
All right. Bye, everyone.